So thank you. As our host is actually Faculty of Education at the University of Ljubljana, now I would like to give a floor to our Dean, Mr. Janez Vogrinc. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, on behalf of the University of Ljubljana, Faculty of Education, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all participants of the conference organized by the network Teacher Education Policy in Europe, entitled Challenges of Distance Teaching in Teacher Education and Education. It makes our faculty very proud to host the 15th conference of this network. I'm also very happy as this is the first international conference we have organized since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it makes me sad that we are not able to welcome you in our faculty building here in Ljubljana. The Faculty of Education, University in Ljubljana, is the oldest and the largest faculty of education in Slovenia. We offer 7 bachelor degree programs, 12 master's degree programs, and 1 doctoral program, Teacher Education and Educational Sciences. Our specific is that in the first cycle, we run only pedagogical study programs. We educate future pedagogical professionals for all levels of the educational system, from preschool education to primary and secondary school. In addition to preschool, primary, and secondary teachers, experts who are competent to work with groups of people with special needs also graduate from our faculty. The pandemic has completely changed people's lives around the world. Things that we used to take for granted have become unattainable in the blink of an eye. Traveling, socializing, shaking hands have become mere desires. School systems had to adapt to a completely new situation overnight. All teachers were suddenly forced to become digital literacy experts. Especially with younger students, parents often took over the role of teachers. Researchers in education, such as educationalists, pedagogues, psychologists, sociologists, and others, soon began to point out potential negative consequences of the long closure of schools and other educational institutions on various domains of child development. For example, on motor and socialization skills, but also on their learning and acquired knowledge. I'm convinced that a number of interesting and valuable research studies have been undertaken during this period, and many researchers have come to significant research findings. We may assume that some of these findings might be more relevant for a specific educational context. However, there will be most probably some solutions with the potential to be generalized across educational and social systems. In the time of lockdown, it was also the teacher educators who found themselves in a special position. On the one hand, they were forced to become online teachers overnight. And on the other, they soon started to realize what kinds of knowledge and competencies their graduates had not acquired during their study, and what kind of changes should be made to the accredited study programs. I'm confident that this conference is a great opportunity to share empirical data on distance education, as well as examples of good practice and ideas for future research studies and teaching practice. My sincere thanks go to all those who have put an enormous amount of energy and expertise into planning and organizing this very much awaited conference. Let me wish you every success in the future. And of course, stay healthy and keep safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Vogrinc, for this warm welcome. Of course, you're invited to be with us in this first round of speeches. And now I would like to extend the word to Professor Eisenschmidt and Professor Marco Snoek for a welcome on behalf of the TEPE network, please.
Thank you, Professor Janez, Professor Krek. And together with Professor Eisenschmidt, I would like to welcome you to this online TEPE conference. It's the annual conference that's organized by the TEPE network, and we are very happy to see so many people coming together on this online conference. My name is Marco Snoek. I'm a professor at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences, and together with Yves, we are part of the board of the Teacher Education Policy in Europe network. And I would like to introduce very shortly some characteristics of the network, but before I would like to do that, I would like to congratulate Professor Pavel Zgaga, Professor Janez Krek, and Ivo Repak, and their team in organizing this conference. As Mr. Vogrinc already mentioned, that the pandemic has impacted education in quite a strong way. It has also impacted the Teacher Education Policy in Europe network. We have not been able, this time for the second time, to organize our annual conference on location, and we had to do it on a virtual way. And on one hand, it is a pity that it's not possible to socialize, to meet each other, to discuss and to chat during coffee breaks and during dinners. But at the same time, it creates new opportunities. It creates the opportunity to have a very rich program in a very efficient way, in a very sustainable way, in a very cheap way. For instance, in some way, we don't have to pay travel costs. It takes less time and it saves energy to have it in this way. And 1 year ago, we had a similar conference organized by the University of Helsinki. And actually, we experienced that even if it's online and we are not able to see each other face to face, that it still can be an enriching conference. And looking at the program, I really want to congratulate the team who are from the Faculty of Education of the University of Ljubljana who organized the program, because they've been able to create a context which challenged more than 50 presenters to share their experience with us in a very short and condensed program. And that attracted more than 200 participants from a variety of countries. So I think that's a great effort to be able in this times of pandemics and closure or partial closure of systems to organize it in this way. And on the one hand, you could say, well, it's a very rich program. It's a very full program, and I really hope that you are able to join in during the whole of the program, because all those different presentations give really a state of the art of issues around digital education and teacher education. So once again, I would like to congratulate the team who made this all possible. Just a few words about the TEPE network. Let's share my screen. So I will start to introduce a few elements. Let's see, yes. And maybe just to start with the TEPE network, the Teacher Education Policy in Europe network. And the network starts from the idea that teachers are the key of the quality of education. But if we recognize that teachers are the key in the quality of education, And actually teacher education is the key in the quality of teachers that contributes to an inclusive and democratic society. So that makes teacher education one of the key elements in the quality of an educational system. And from that respect, we thought that it would be very important to bring together a variety of stakeholders in an open and academic network, bringing together stakeholders around teacher education and together to focus on improving the quality of teacher education in Europe. And we want to do that, to create that network in order to bridge teacher education practice, teacher education research, teacher education policy. And to do that through a collaborative dialogue, bringing together people involved in practice, research, and policies, trying to strengthen and stimulate the quality of teacher education. And I think this conference is one of the key elements of creating that type of dialogue. So we try to exchange practices, insights, knowledge to inspire each other and to create a dialogue through this annual conference. But also, and that's again, you could say that the COVID pandemic has created many problems, but at the same time, it created opportunities. So last year, we started to organize a number of online webinars. We had one on induction and mentoring. We had one on doctoral networks in teacher education. We had one on distance learning in pandemic times. So the COVID pandemic also creates new opportunities that we embrace and try to take up to strengthen the dialogue that we aim. The third element is that we try to share the outcomes of research through publications and in this way inspire both teacher education policies and practices. And I think we're very excited to mention that we've made an agreement with Brill Publishers to launch a TEPE book series on key issues in teacher education, policy, research, and practice. So in the coming years, we are able to share these outcomes with the different stakeholders around teacher education. So that's the general idea. Maybe it's good to take a short look towards the previous webinar we organized. It was on distance learning in pandemic times, and actually it was a start-up for this conference. So can I give the floor to you, Eva?
Yes. Hello, everyone. And first, I would like to say thank you for colleagues from University of Ljubljana. And I am also missing a lot coming over to Slovenia. I really like this country, and the video you showed actually raised several emotions I have experienced in Slovenia. And I also would like to congratulate all our network members, because we may say that our network is really resilient, because we are still keeping our annual conferences, although we are facing quite turbulent times. And as already Marco said, that we also had sort of pre-webinar for this conference, and the aim of the webinar was to introduce results of distance learning studies in different countries, and of course focusing on what dilemmas and challenges teachers and schools face in a context of the pandemic. And some questions have reminded from our pre-webinar, for example, teachers' new role and competencies, how to share agency with students, the skills and abilities to support self-regulated learning, and didactical competencies and online pedagogy, teaching in different kind of web-based environments. And the other area of the questions which are very, very important are related to students' needs. And even more than the earlier need for personalized learning paths came up, and also how to support low socioeconomic background students with low socioeconomic background students and students with special needs. We may say that broadly we addressed 2 areas at least. Digital challenge, how digital competence could be of teachers and didactics of digital classroom and distance learning in initial teacher education can be improved, and also very, very important area, how mental well-being of students and teachers are supported and considered, for example, avoiding burnout of teachers and also noticing and addressing mental health problems of students. So I see, or we may say that the recent developments in different educational systems have supported preparedness for distance learning period, but it seems that these trends are not enough implemented in everyday practices. For example, student-centeredness and active learning and methodologies are addressed for a long time, but while we faced this distance learning environment or mode, we really struggled to adapt our pedagogy or teaching methods. So we see, or I see really, that this conference is excellent opportunity to discuss further these topics, which are highly relevant for all national systems, organizations, and for a single teacher or teacher educator. So, and recently, we were really happy to launch our network new web page, and because of many support and from Aarhus University colleagues, and as we really ask you and to open this web page and throughout the conference to stay in that web page, we really hope to post also some news in that web page. So enjoy the conference.
Thank you. Thank you very much, dear Marco and dear Eve, for these introductory words in the context of TEPE network. Our next speaker, Professor Pavel Zgaga, has been a part of TEPE projects from the very beginning, 15 years ago. And he will now offer a brief look into the history of the TEPE and network, and maybe offer some vision for the future. Please, Professor Zgaga, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Janez. Dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to extend yet another warm welcome to all of you, this time on my behalf as one, as you just heard, of those who have been very close to the TEPE network from its very start 15 years ago. And that's why I would like to emphasize that this time, this year, the network is celebrating a modest anniversary, 15 years since its inception. Metaphorically, then, one could say that the network has graduated this year from the primary school, isn't it? It is therefore probably right to take this opportunity to recall the past steps and the context in which they were taken, while considering what new steps need to be put on the agenda for the coming years. As you heard, the TEPE network was founded in 2006, October 2006, at Umeå University in Sweden. As a small initiative group of 5 or 6 colleagues, if I remember well, from 3 or 4 countries, we found at our first meeting that the developments of European cooperation in teacher education had reached a level where new ambitious goals had to be set, such as, first, mapping and analyzing trends in teacher education across Europe. Second, engaging in the joint design of new curricula for undergraduate or initial teacher education, and addressing the issue of their comparability and compatibility at European level in order to better promote participation in exchange programs like Erasmus and similar. Third, supporting for the development of master's and doctoral level programs in teacher education, which did not exist before. Fourth, developing policy recommendations and concrete strategies for teacher education institutions. And fifth, networking these institutions across Europe and influencing policy-making processes at institutional, national, as well as European international level. In short, the idea was that teacher education had become too important an area to leave only to institutional and political decision makers, but that those most directly affected should also be involved in policy making. Teachers and teacher educators, including teacher education researchers. The conviction that teacher education policy must be research-based was therefore taken very seriously by this group from the very beginning. And the expansion of the network in the following years confirmed, this is what I believe, that many colleagues across Europe wanted to contribute to these goals. It is not my intention, of course, to analyze the performance of the network during all these 15 years. I would prefer to leave a critical evaluation to other unbiased reviewers, if I may say so. Nevertheless, I cannot completely disregard some important facts. The network has grown considerably in the 15 years. Conferences have been held continuously and in different parts of Europe, north and south, east and west. A considerable collection of monographs and journal articles has been edited and published. The knowledge gained has been used by many teacher education institutions, and at least in some countries, it has also influenced national and sometimes international strategies. For example, in occasional cooperation with the European Commission and the Council of Europe, but also beyond European borders in cooperation with UNESCO. But as I said, in the minutes available to me today, I would rather focus on two other issues. First, remembering the context in which the TEPE network was born, and second, reflecting on the context in which we find ourselves lately, including looking at the challenging tasks ahead. I think that some of these tasks are very directly linked to the theme of this conference. The middle of the first decade of this century was a very different time from today, both on a general level and in the specific area of teacher education. In the past, teacher education was generally excluded from the university environment. It had a lower status than other public professions, and it was generally excluded from international educational cooperation. However, in the 90s, this tradition was radically challenged. The beginning of the participation of teacher education institutions in various European Commission programs, including Erasmus, certainly contributed to this. The first major project in this area was the thematic network on teacher education in Europe, abbreviation TNTEE, which took place in the late 90s and culminated in an influential policy document in 2000 entitled The Green Paper on Teacher Education in Europe. On the other hand, the Tuning project, which began in 2000 and aimed to modernize a whole range of university courses, included teacher education and educational sciences from the outset, and this project cannot be bypassed. 10 or more teacher education institutions participated in the TNTEE and in the Tuning projects. And for the first time, they faced the question raised by increased European integration in the 90s. How to connect, how to strengthen internationally isolated, fragmented, and neglected teacher education. How to educate a European teacher. The timing was opportune. On the one hand, Europe faced the challenge of building a knowledge society and economy, and realized that this goal was not possible without a thorough strengthening of the education sector. On the other hand, European countries joined forces in the Bologna process to achieve comparability and compatibility of their education systems, curricula, and educational qualifications. By the middle of the first decade of the new millennium, it was already clear that longer and more academically demanding bachelor degree programs for initial teacher education were coming, including the right to obtain master's and doctoral degrees in teacher education and educational sciences at teacher education institutions. Teacher education has therefore gained significantly in its status during the first decade of this millennium. This then is the context in which the TEPE network was founded. And it is certainly not surprising that one of its first tasks was to strengthen the voice of teacher education institutions in discussions about teacher education policy. In subsequent years, this voice has been expanded to include a range of issues, such as, to name but a few, the quality of teacher education, learning spaces with technology in the classroom, building partnerships in teacher education, sustainability and ethics in teacher education and in education policy, and so on and so forth. And now we are 15 years later, colleagues. The zeitgeist has completely changed, both in general and in the specific area of teacher education. The turn of the millennium was generally marked by optimistic expectation of European integration, cooperation, and economic and cultural development. But towards the end of the first decade of the new millennium, the world was suddenly marked by a global economic crisis with many consequences, which in the second decade also manifested in phenomena such as Euroscepticism, the migrants crisis, resistance to otherness, illiberal politics, Brexit, reclosing national borders, and so on. Phenomena which were not known before. All of this has left its mark on education as a whole, including teacher education. I wrote elsewhere 7 years ago, I think that teacher education has often found itself in heavy seas in the past. But in the last year, the hurricane waves we have known in the past have been compounded by the waves of the COVID epidemic. At this point, I think, we should begin to reflect on the current context and tasks facing teacher education policy today. I can by no means imagine that I will be able to provide an answer to these very complex challenges in the next few minutes, but I am convinced that our 3-day conference will make an important contribution to understanding and resolving at least some of these issues. The first months of last year were an unexpected and unpleasant surprise all over the world. For a long time, we did not believe that stories such as Boccaccio tells at the beginning of his Decameron could be anything but fiction in the 21st century. But modern human ideas of what is fiction and what is reality have proven again to be just as problematic as they were in the past. And this is also true in the field of education. In more and more countries, kindergartens, schools, colleges have been closed, virtually all over the world and literally overnight. At the same time, the technological equipment of modern civilization was almost universally presented as a consolation on the basis of which learning and teaching from home was supposed not to be a problem at all. Fiction. First, but not last. Of course, over the last few decades, we have encountered various issues in relation to the use of ICT and distance learning. We know something about that. But even when schools were at their most advanced in this regard, the use of ICT was only a support for pedagogical work, not a substitute for it. What has been forgotten, I think, is the old humanistic insight that evil and good are not to be found in the material, if you wish, objective world. For example, in technical means, but in the human social world. The insight that the evil that can be associated, for example, with the use of modern technical means lies primarily or is primarily a matter of social action and social structures. Today, more than a year after the outbreak of the pandemic, we have more and more experience and more research-based evidence of how profound and severe the consequences have been for the younger generations who have been forced to homeschooling over the last year and a half. For example, earlier this week, survey results in one of our newspapers suggesting that during the epidemic, the gap between children from families with higher education and those children from families with lower levels of education only widened. The motto of quality education for all, UNESCO, that has guided us in recent times, faces today a serious challenge. This is the first of the crucial points to which all attention must be paid, both in research and in practical work in schools, and not least in teacher education institutions. Another broad subject to which much attention should be given is, in a similar way, and with as many parties as possible, is the question why in some countries the schools were closed so long. Was this justified? What were the consequences? How to deal with similar cases that may still occur in the future? Slovenia is one of those European countries where schools were closed the longest, despite warnings from teachers and experts that some specific aspects of closed institutions were highly controversial. It was only after an appeal that the Constitutional Court ruled that government regulations on closed educational institutions, in particular institutions for the education of children with special needs, were unconstitutional. This raises the third important question. It is quite clear, and for me it is absolutely indisputable, that a pandemic requires a limit on physical contacts in the population. But let me make a note here on margins. Physical contact, not social contact. Among the victims of the pandemic was obviously also language. There has been, and still is, much talk on social distancing, you remember? Rather than physical distancing, which make sense. Okay, with the perfectly understandable demand for such a restriction, physical restriction, I repeat, it is also clear that not all contact can simply be restricted in population. Medical personnel, for example, need to be in contact with patients, also during the pandemic, in particular during the pandemic. And firefighters need to be in contact with the people who need their help during the pandemic, and so on. So it is a question of priorities, and negotiating priorities requires a political decision, a political process. The question, therefore, is, why has education ended up at the bottom of the priority list in many countries? Perhaps because of the fiction that teachers can do anything through technological means. Because of the belief that Zoom can completely replace educational institutions and the teaching profession. Because of a complete lack of understanding of what educational profession is actually about in modern civilization. As I read the abstracts of the papers for this conference, I was pleased, very pleased, to find that many of them also address the issues that concern me so much. I hope, therefore, that this conference, in parallel with many other activities around the world, will contribute to the progressive clarification of these questions and dilemmas. Teachers at all levels and in all subject areas, including teachers of teachers in teacher education institutions, have a very long agenda ahead of them. It will be necessary to clarify the extent of the decline in knowledge in certain areas and what pedagogical strategies are available to us to compensate for this decline more quickly. It will be necessary to clarify how to deal with the consequences that have arisen at the social and emotional level of children, young people, university students, and so on and so forth. It will have to be clarified what kind of educational policy we need in the current situation. And finally, teacher education institutions will have to find ways in which both initial and in-service teacher education can respond more effectively to the problems we face in the present schools and universities. I will listen with great interest to our discussions, which will take place until noon on Saturday. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Zgaga, for sharing your thoughts with us and some vision. Before a short break, which will be followed then by Professor Zappel's lecture, I would like to present some information on how the conference will take place. You have received at different levels such information, but anyway, I will point out some information again. As for hosts, as you know, all sessions have a chair whose names you may find in the program. And in addition to chairs, each session will be hosted by representatives of University of Ljubljana. They will have special virtual background with the staff. If you experience any kind of technical problems, please contact them directly by using chat function in Zoom, or send us an email to that email which you may find at the first chat which was posted there. As far as posting questions is concerned, of course, the TEPE conference will be an interactive event for everyone. Attendees will have the opportunity to ask questions directly by switching on their camera and microphone to do so. The host will also keep track on the questions submitted into the chat by participants. As you noticed, upon the entry, you are muted by default, and we kindly ask you to keep yourselves muted unless you have been invited to ask a question. There is no need to have your camera on during the session, but please do so when asking the questions. To ask a question, please use the chat function and write out the question you wish to ask. At the end of the presentation, if your question is selected, you will be invited to ask it yourself directly. When invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself, switch on your camera and state your name and where are you from. Please note, depending on the number of attendees in the particular session or presenters' preferences, the chair may also decide to accept questions during the presentation and or read them from chat by himself or herself. There is some general information in addition. Please note that participants are free to change sessions as they wish. With other words, you can attend one presentation of your interest in one session and then switch to another session in the middle of it. The sessions will be recorded. If you are using the speaker view in Zoom, it allows you to see more clearly who is talking. And there is some short special reminder for chairs and presenters. You should have already received all the necessary instruction by email. But allow me to once again kindly remind you that it is expected that you log into your Zoom session 10 minutes before the scheduled beginning. And one last word about certificate of attendance. After the end of the conference, we will prepare a certificate of attendance next week and send it to your email addresses. So it was not about the coffee and restaurants and so on, only some dull technical information, but still I think that it is useful to remind us all what are the rules of engagement in this conference. Now we will have a short break until 5 p.m. Before a keynote speech, and we will begin sharply at 5 p.m.